So let's set that to one side for right now. Tracy, why don't you go through the homework here, right? Grab a marker. See about if we can figure out the impact of a tariff. And you know, why don't we just start from scratch, right? That's a good way to, right? Then we can check, you can check it afterwards. Again, I know that that's not our instinct, but I hope we start to develop that instinct. Again, the more practice we get, one way to practice is to go over it again. So, no, I just switched it to the viewfinder thinking that'll probably save on the battery. We'll see. But thank you, Daniel. Appreciate it. So again, right, some of these you go, I don't know. Well, but I always have a place to start, right? We went over a market where we're importing, we can set that up, and then we can think through the policy and figure out what impact that will have. So personally, so that I remember that that's not the world supply is out here, right? I usually will label that PW as the world price over on the axis. Does that make sense? Because that's not actually the world supply. The world supply is like a few blocks out that way, and it looks like a normal supply schedule, probably. Of course, in the real world, it may well look like something like that. It may not be straight. That's okay. So you put on your tariff. Okay? Good. And what would the price be if we just left it alone? So we now have, again, three situations. We can look at a situation, what we might call free trade. Of course, it's not completely free. We have rule structures in place. Let's think. Well, if we didn't have anything, if we didn't have anything going on, now we're going to have a couple really small areas here. Well, actually, if we're comparing this, let's go ahead and put in where we would expect to be if we didn't have international trade at all. Right? So that would be another option. So we can look at no trade, we can look at a tariff, and we can look at free trade. Now this is going to mean we have more areas here, but this will allow us to have a compared to what, right? Remember, depending on what we compare this to, the answer could change quite a bit. Now this is, you're fine. It was just, right? It just meant, here, let's do this. What this meant, so we've got the tariff. You know what, to make our lives a little easier, not because there's any reason to do this, let's just move the tariff down maybe to here, right? So in other words, this distance here would equal the tariff, right? Okay. And now we can put some letters in there. And if we need to, I'm just going to put this up here. Whatever letters you want, you could put in there. You with me? Rather than trying to cram them into that small area. Okay. So now we could look at three situations: no trade, tariff, international trade. Now probably the ones we should be most comfortable with at this point, we should be pretty comfortable with no trade, right? No international trade. There's still domestic trade. That's going to look like what we started out with, isn't it? So just to be clear, are we talking about no trade here?
Yeah.
Okay. Right? No, you're fine. It's just a matter of, right, I like to label them because as you've discovered, once you get into the weeds, it can get kind of easy to forget which one you're working with. Mm-hmm. So. Nice. Yeah, nicely done. I think F too, right? It's easy to forget it just because it's up there,
It's
but.
up there.
Excellent. Should look pretty familiar, even though it's chopped up in some slightly different ways here, right?
I'll put that up there so
Yeah,
not lost here.
yeah. Okay, good. Now the tricky bits, right?
Yeah.
So with trade and no tariff, or with trade and, just so we're clear, right? Okay. With trade and no tariff,
That's that one.
nice. Is that what producers are receiving? Domestic producers. At the world price, how many units are they selling?
Oh, this one.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So this is one of those cases where the habit of taking what consumers gave up and transferring that to producers doesn't necessarily, it does hold, it's just that part of that is going to foreigners, right? International producers. Oh, you were fine with consumers, weren't you?
Oh. yeah,
Right?
that's a little- Now I'll have to figure out where I am.
Because consumers are buying this many units, they're buying this many from domestic producers, they're buying this many from the foreigners. They are giving up all of this. So you were solid there.
Okay.
It's just that that didn't all go to the domestic producers. Now let's just try this.
Yeah.
A D cancels a D, E cancels an E, I cancels an I, and a K cancels a K. That's why I like to write it out. I can outsource my thinking to some pretty basic crossing out of things. Of course, then you have to make sure you write clearly enough that you can read what you've written. Nice. Okay, good. And now producers are selling this quantity. Yep. So their total benefit is D and E,
And there's some.
and their total cost.
It's E or K.
Well, let's see. Remember, we can pull these apart, right? This is why I do this. So if we pull this apart, supply tells us marginal cost, we have benefit and quantity. When suppliers sell this quantity here, we know this must be their benefit. And we also know that supply is a marginal cost schedule, right? So this one cost them this, and cost, 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 cost. So their total cost would be what? They're selling this many units,
Mhm.
so what would their total cost be?
E, D, and E.
D and E?
Or,
Cost, cost,
E.
E, right? Yeah. It's the same picture, it's just that we have it chopped up a little differently, which makes people kind of eyes blur and makes it a little hard to focus, okay? Good? Nice.
oh, not today.
Yep. A, B, C, D, F, G, H, and J. Excellent. Okay, good. Solid. Now the tariff.
What's the tariff?
Yeah, now we have to figure out the tariff. Actually, we have a bit of an issue here, don't we? Let's stop for a moment and we can fix this because we're going to actually have to dump in a few more letters, it turns out. Because before, domestic producers were having to sell at this price, right? Why were they having to sell at this price? Because consumers had the option of purchasing from foreigners at this price. Now with the tariff, the foreigners are, in order for them to sell us these goods, how much are they going to have to receive? They're going to have to receive this much, right? If we offer them less than that, they'd sell to somebody abroad because they can get this much abroad. So what happens? Effectively, when these goods are sold in this country, foreign producers are going to receive that much. This is going to be the tax, right? And so what is so now, if you were a consumer, you could either buy from domestic producers at this price or foreigners at this price. Who would you buy from?
Foreigners.
You'd buy from the foreigners, which means that now the domestic producers can get away with charging this, right? They'll still be able to sell the goods. And at that price, consumers are going to buy that quantity there. Are we clear on that?
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to have to, let's see if I've got F, G. I'm just going to enlarge this, right? And then we'll fix the, right? See if we can fix the letters. Yeah, one of the tricks here is, this is one of the reasons why oftentimes we'll draw these fairly large. There's, we have our price with the tariff.
Now, is your tariff always going to be a little bit lower than the domestic price?
No, we could actually have such a large tariff that the effective world price was up here, couldn't we?
Sure.
And now, if you have a choice of buying from foreigners at this price or domestic producers at this price, who would you buy from?
Domestic.
You'd buy from domestic producers. That would kill all imports, and we would be back at our sort of no trade picture.
Yeah.
And so usually tariffs aren't that high.
I was just thinking that you would think that they'd be as high as the domestic market.
Right, and
You
we
know,
could
to
look
make
at
it
that,
even,
right?
And even, make them.
Again, we can, usually what we do is we look at a tariff that isn't going to completely kill everything. You're fine, I'm just,
Oh, okay. So.
but we can, right? It depends on how you've drawn it.
So how do you know what size to make your tariff if you're just check out the effect of a tariff,
I mean, it's like a hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
I'm less concerned about that, right?
Okay.
In the real world, like again, this was one of the things that a colleague actually, he's at Texas Tech now, but he was at the Council for Economic Advisors. That's what he did for 2 years, was trying to estimate the impact of the Trump administration's tariffs on Americans,
Wow, that's
right? And so for him, he's going to be sitting here saying, how big is the tariff? Did the tariff push us to here? Did it push us to here?
Uh-huh.
And then actually putting numbers on these things.
Okay.
I'm not particularly, right, I can, depending on your drawing, I can follow through and see if it made sense,
Okay.
right?
Yep.
So I'm less concerned about that necessarily. We could even do that now, right? We could do an additional one, which would be, we jack the tariff all the way to, in effect, we could call this either no trade or a really big tariff, a tariff that pushes the effective world price above the domestic price, right?
Yeah.
It'll give us the exact same comparative statics here.
Totally. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I think that this middle ground is a good one.
Yeah, well, let's see, what's their cost? They're consuming this quantity here, right?
Yeah.
So that means if we pull these back apart, because it's getting gnarly here, right? In order for people to consume this quantity, this must be their cost. So cost, right?
Okay, so.
Is A and B part of their cost? Cost.
Yeah, I think this would be
Nice. Excellent, right? And then I like the instinct there, Tracy, of double checking, right? It's like, oh, is that right? Yeah. Did I get all the letters? Yeah. Now we just have to cancel things out. Although, let's just double check the first part. The second part's right. So benefit, 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 benefit. This whole area here.
Missed I.
I think we missed I and J, right? Good. And this again, I would say, is not, right? By now you're starting to see that if we turn the crank, the system isn't conceptually difficult, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's just a piece of cake, right? We do have to still focus, but once we've got this set up, we don't necessarily have to tax our brains particularly. Let's see, producers are selling this quantity, right? Wasn't necessarily disagreeing, I was just checking.
Yeah.
Right? At the tariff, domestic producers, right? Nice. Excellent. Government 0, negative, or positive?
Positive.
Yeah, this is the case of a tax. Now again, if the tariff was so high that we were importing nothing, then government would be 0, despite there being a tax. But it is, right? But in this case, is it 0?
No.
No, government is collecting a tax, isn't it? So is it going to be 0?
No.
No. Now we have to turn our brain on and figure out what it is. But we know, first of all, it's going to be positive, assuming it might be 0 or it might be positive, right? It's not going to be negative because this is... So, the government is collecting this much here, right, on all the goods that are imported. This is not a tax, this is not just a sales tax, right? This is not a tax being collected on domestically produced goods. We are collecting the tax on imports. And what is the quantity of our imports? Well, this is the quantity supplied domestically with the tariff, right? This is the quantity demanded domestically with the tariff, which means that distance there are imports with the tariff, right? So we're collecting this much on every unit that is imported. So we're collecting nothing for these units, right? Because they're being produced domestically. So we're collecting this much. Yeah, nicely done. And we have to add that to total surplus, don't we? And now we could look at the impact of the tariff. Now what could we compare it to? Well, we could compare it to free trade, right? In which case, this would be maybe our 1 and this would be our 2, right? Now, I oftentimes might just say free to the tariff, right? This helps me keep track of what I'm working on, in which case this would be our 1, and this would be our 2, and now we can do our change in consumer, producer, government, and total.
They're the same.
Let's see. We have the tariff here. Consumer surplus minus, oh, no, we're down here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think we missed something down here. I screwed that one up. Let's see. C. Yeah, no, I did with the tariff. So let's see. We were missing C, D, C, G, H, K, and N. So we had A, B, C, D, I, J, G, H, no, K, and N, right? Again, I shouldn't be taking shortcuts. That's precisely why I try not to take them. Okay? So the tariff, we have this Free trade, we have this, so this minus this,
Oh, that one. Okay.
right? Again, that's why I often, now we could look at the impact of eliminating the tariff. That would then, right, so nicely done. And now the change in producer surplus. Yeah, they've gained C. Good?
So, and the import is what's coming into the country?
Correct. They're goods that we are purchasing from foreigners.
Okay.
Right.
And then exports are what we're selling?
Correct.
Okay.
What we're selling to foreigners, yes.
Right.
Yep, that's nice. And so compared to free trade, is the tariff good or bad? What do you think?
Bad.
It's bad. Well, it's bad for consumers and it's bad for society. It's good for producers and it's good for government in the sense that there's more revenue in the treasury, right? So again, politically, this tells us who might be in favor of tariffs. Are they good for American consumers?
No.
No. Are they good for American producers? Yes, but the benefit to the producers is more than, right? So we've transferred C from consumers to producers. We've transferred H and K from consumers to government, and we destroyed G and N. We'll have to turn our brains back on in a moment and figure out where that went. All right, so now let's compare the tariff to no trade, or to a really big tariff, right?
So the term tariff, isn't that like a tax in a way?
It is literally a tax on imports.
Oh.
Yeah, it's just shorthand. I don't know the etymology or the origins of how we went from tax on imports to tariff. It turns out that historically, tariffs were the lion's share of taxes. There were very few other taxes. This country, particularly in its early days, funded the federal government almost entirely on import duties.
Wow.
Right?
Like in the 1700s?
Well, we didn't have an income tax until the early 1900s, right? There were, no, I
I
mean, there
didn't
were,
realize, I don't know.
yeah,
You know?
no, I think it was
I don't know the
19,
history of taxes.
1912, 19,
I heard the tea tax was a big deal.
yeah, right, we had stamp taxes. Actually the tea tax wasn't what they were upset about. They were actually upset that the tea from the British East India Company was being exempted from taxes. They were actually protesting the fact that there weren't taxes on the East India Company's tea. Because most of the founders were smugglers. And of course, what happens if you get rid of the tariff? People who were smuggling things in illegally face a lower price, and they were basically very upset, right? We tend to pitch the Boston Tea Party as an example of patriotism and social goodwill. In fact, it was basically a bunch of people who were upset that their illegal and illicit livelihoods were being threatened, so they destroyed all of that tea in the hopes of keeping the price of tea
Pretty high.
that they could charge high.
Because of a reduction in supply.
Yes.
Did I go the right way?
Let's
Sounds
see.
pretty American.
So no trade. Let's just see. So this is why I oftentimes will do this, right? So no trade, we take no trade and subtract
Okay, so I did.
tariff. Yeah, so we get the right magnitudes, but we get the wrong signs, right? Look up.
Did you get a new phone?
I did. Yes. 6 years out of the old one. I could have made it last longer, but this one was small and it was relatively cheap.
Is it the iPhone 8?
No, it's the SE. Nicely done. So compared to no trade or a really big tariff, which one's better? So is a tariff better or worse than no trade?
Better.
It's better, right? Compared to free trade, is it better or worse? It's worse. Remember that compared to what question? What we compare things to can completely flip our answer. Thanks, guys.
Tariff to no trade. So no trade is way worse.
I'm curious here.
You know, there's a place you can recycle your old phone in town.
I'm sure. I have to get all the data off the first. It actually is still functional in terms of, right, keeping it for another, if I start recording lectures with more professional settings, I may use it as a alternate camera, so I'm not gonna get rid of it just yet.
That's a good idea.
First personal income tax, I'm sorry, it was 1861. Oh, to pay for the Civil War. It was repealed.
Wow,
So
I
I
had
was-
no idea.
It was only in okay, so it was in 1894 that we had our first, I was wrong, I was off by about 18 years, right? So 1894 was the first peacetime income tax. And the slogan was never more than 1%, my boy, never more than 1%.
Was it taxed in the US?
Yes, that was the first peacetime income tax, was in 1894. All right, questions on this? Is this what you got with your homework?
Pretty close, yeah.
Maybe, maybe not.
Pretty much close.
Okay. Now we can extend this and say, let's compare this to a quota, right?
There's a quota.
So quota is a maximum amount that can be imported. We're not going to put any tariffs on things. We're saying you can import it for no tax, but instead of importing all of this, right? Instead of being able to import as much as you want, maybe we say you can only import this much, right? Well, what happens? Well, if we look at this, now instead of being able to import all of this stuff, we can only import this much, and let's just assume these two are the same, right? And so now at the world price, we get this much from domestic producers, we get this much from foreigners, which causes this to be the quantity supplied in aggregate. You following?
Yep.
This, however, is still the quantity demanded at that price, isn't it? What do we have? Here's our quantity supplied. Here's our quantity demanded. What is that? That's a shortage, right? It's empty shelves.
You'd expect the
We still
price
have,
to increase.
yeah, now that would cause the price to increase. And where would we end up? We would expect it to increase until this distance here represents the quantity of goods that can be imported. Cameron?
Isn't a shortage when supply exceeds demand?
No, a shortage is when quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. When quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, then we have a surplus.
So when the supply is less than demand?
No, quantity supplied. Remember, supply refers to the entire schedule.
Oh, the quantity.
If we said supply is less than demand, this was the exam question, right? I have a very hard time thinking about that. That would require like demand out here and what? Supply would,
A straight line or something.
I mean, supply would just, what, do this? That doesn't work, right? Does that make sense, right? So this is why that language is important.
So it's the quantity supplied.
When the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, then we're stable. So initially we would be unstable, we would have a shortage, which would cause the price to rise. And eventually, as I've drawn it, assuming this is the size of the quota, and again this is useful because it makes it so we have fewer areas, now we could look at the impact of this, right? As the price rose, that would cause suppliers, domestic suppliers, to bring more to market. It would cause some consumers to consume less. We'd end up at this being the quantity demanded, this being the quantity supplied domestically, this quantity in here being imported, because that's the legally permissible import. And now we can turn the crank on this and look at another situation. Of the impact of a quota.
So what percentage are typical tariffs?
It really depends on the era, it depends on the goods. There's also the stated and the effective rates. It depends on the country because of WTO guidelines, right? Some countries that are members of the WTO, they get lower rates. Some countries have negotiated bilateral trade treaties. Sarah?
So isn't it just gonna come out to the same thing as the tariff though?
Well, let's see. Go ahead and turn the crank, right? Consumers, what quantity are they consuming? Now they're going to be consuming this quantity here, right? So this would be their total benefit.
So MKJA.
And minus their total cost. Bless you.
Thank you.
Now, what's government with a quota? Government making money or spending money? Neither,
Nothing.
right?
Okay.
Okay. So again, now we could view this as saying, look, politically perhaps we need to help those producers. And now the question is, which policy is less harmful, a tariff or a quota? You with me?
It looks like quota.
So we could, in that case, which is less harmful for the same impact on producers? Did this policy, did the tariff and the quota, as I've set it up, have the same impact on producers? Yes, it did, right? It helped them gain C. And so the question is, which was a less costly or damaging way to get there? So from that, we could look at going from a tariff to a quota or vice versa, right? Either way, it's just then you have to, so I'm going to do it that way. Consumer surplus, the change is going to be 0. Change in producer surplus is 0. Change in government is a loss of H and K. Change in total surplus is a loss of H and K. What does that tell us?
And a quota's not good.
That a quota is worse than a tariff. So if we had to rank this, the worst is no trade. Then we had a quota. Then we have a tariff. And then we have what we would call, again, free trade or unrestricted international trade.
Right, because another reason why is because like government, even if they got money, they can never spend it well enough to make a better gain. Isn't that
Not
when we looked at
necessarily.
subsidies? Isn't that kind of how we saw subsidies? Is that hey,
No,
tax
what we
something
said with
here, but we-
subsidies is that the subsidy, so it depends. We haven't yet found something we can spend this money on,
Okay.
but for us, at least H and K is still available to us as a society, right?
Yes.
With a quota, it's not available to Americans anymore.
Yeah.
So at least, now, again, we still have the puzzle of what we could, now if we took H and K in the government revenue and used it to subsidize something like car production,
We would still lose something.
we're gonna then have our typical destruction in that market, right?
Yes.
But at least here, those resources are still available to us. Make sense? Let's stop for a moment and figure out, as a result of going from free trade to a tariff, the change in total surplus was a loss of G and N. Now we have to turn our brains back on and figure out where that went, right?
Yeah.
This is similar to what you did on what I tasked you with on the homework. We could actually start there, right? Let's start there, actually. Let's not go from free trade to a tariff. Let's go from no trade to free trade, in which case the change in total surplus was G, H, I, J, K, and N, right? I get that right? Does that look like what? Previously, with no trade, we had A, B, C, and D. With trade, we had, this was consumer surplus, this was producer surplus, government was nothing. So where did G, H, I, J, K, and N come from? What did you come up with on the homework? Right, we turned the crank, we got that right, now we have to figure out, we have to turn our brains back on. Guillermo? No idea? Paige, what did you come up with?
I don't know, just something with the tariff, so.
Well, here now I've changed it on you, right? Now we're dealing with exactly what we'd set out on the, at least part of the homework, which was going from no trade to free trade. We had this improvement in well-being, and the question was, where did it come from?
Yeah, that really stumped me.
Good, right? Okay, so let's think about what was the impact of this. Well, one of the impacts was consumers now, instead of consuming this quantity here, and I know this is getting messy, but you're following along, I'm hoping. Consumers, instead of consuming this quantity, now get this quantity. So we have to look at these units right here, right? And what else happened? Instead of producing this quantity, domestic producers produced only that quantity. So we could split these out. Running out of, even on a big board, I'm running out of room. So let's look at just these units here, right? See if I can get the letters right. G, H, I, F, and L. So, what's the total benefit of those units? Well, we don't actually know because we'd have to draw another line in, right? This would be the total benefit of those units. Well, we got those units before, and so we're still getting them. Has the benefit of those units changed? No. What has changed? Well, before, what was the cost or the value that we were giving up as a society to produce those units? G, H, I, F, and L, right? That's what our supply schedule tells us. And now how much are we giving up to produce those units?
Just E.
No, we're giving up F and L.
Oh, okay.
Those producers are no longer producing. We found a lower cost means of producing these things, haven't we? We buy them from foreigners. We have to transfer, for these units, now we have to transfer that much to the foreigners. We do give that up as value. But previously, we were giving up all this in value. In other words, we have freed up producers to do something of greater value. Will there likely be a loss of employment in this industry?
Yeah.
Yes. There will be a decrease in production in this industry. Does that mean that there will be a decrease in productivity or employment overall? No. Because G, H, I, F, and L represents the value that people would get if they weren't doing this stuff. Doesn't mean it's not scary. Doesn't mean it's not painful. But this is one of the powerful things about our tools is we know that there's something of value for these people to do. That make sense? So G, H, and I is value that we have gained by finding a lower cost means of acquiring that many units, right? Those units right there. How about, so we've got G, H, and I, good. How about J, K, and N? Well, that's coming from additional production, isn't it? So, consumers now, instead of getting just this quantity, get this quantity. So these additional units that we get as a result of international trade, where is J, K, and N coming from? Well, what's the total benefit that consumers place on those units, Tal? These units right here, what's the total value that consumers get out of them? M and O? Well, let's see. Let's pull these back apart. I know that's terrible. These units right here, what's the total benefit consumers get out of them? Well, But we know demand tells us marginal benefit, right? So if we do the thing that I keep doing that you all try and skip, mentally shade this in, benefit, 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 benefit. What's the total benefit that consumers get out of the units from Q1 out to their new quantity?
JKMNO.
Yes, right? And then how much do they give up to get those units?
MO.
M and O. Who do they give those to? They give those to foreigners, so those are no longer resources that are available to domestic citizens, right? And so JK and N is the net benefit of trades that now take place as a result of international trade. Make sense? Oh, it's not necessarily self-evident. Cameron?
Is the US part of the WTO?
Yes. I think we still are. Trump has been saying he was going to pull us out. I'm not sure if that's... Okay.
We like helped set it up, didn't we?
Yes. What do you think? Is the WTO, if it reduces tariffs and non-trade and non-tariff barriers, a good thing or a bad thing for Americans?
Free
Yeah, it's a good thing, right? We still have some tariffs, but if it reduces it, okay.
Is that one of the reasons why we have an issue with like the South China Sea and people trying to make free trade not happen? Is that what-
Well, let's think about, right, what was the impact politically? Who's in favor of tariffs?
Big business.
The producers in this industry, right? Who do you think, and we aren't going to spend much time, eventually I think I have some videos recorded on government, what we should expect from government, right? Who's going to have a strong incentive to go to Congress and tell them about, and maybe pay for a $250,000 fundraiser to get a table with Donald Trump to tell them about how much trade is hurting their business? Producers are, right? Consumers who are going to save a few bucks, but every consumer is going to save a few bucks, and that savings is going to outweigh the harm to the producers. Are you going to be paying $250,000 to go join a fundraiser? No, right? So there's political reality, but there's also, right? These two may completely diverge. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that politicians know this and then are just completely responding to political reality. Some of them may or may not know this. Without these tools, what do we pay attention to? We pay attention to the people who provide us with information, right? So again, just like any other time, if we're going to have social coordination, we need some means of communicating information and providing incentives to act on that information. Questions on this? So now we could say, where did G and N go as a result of the tariff? Right? The impact of the tariff overall was a loss of G and N. Where did they go? Well, as a result of the tariff, it's also, by the way, part of the loss as a result of the quota, isn't it? As a result of the tariff, domestic production and the quota, domestic production went from there to there. So now, instead of giving up just F as a society to produce those units, we are now giving up G and F, right? The benefit of those units is the same. We are now we're giving up more value to get the same thing as before. So we've lost G as a result of that. And where did N go? Well, instead of this quantity here, consumers are only getting that quantity there. N is the benefit of trades, the net benefit of trades that no longer take place anymore. Following? Where did H and K go when we went to a quota? We still are losing G and N. We lose G and N under a tariff and a quota.
Do we just lose H and K under a quota?
We lose H and K under a quota. We do not under a tariff. Under a tariff, H and K is the tariff revenue. Under a quota, what is it?
Just lost value
Yeah, but how is it lost?
because it was never paid in taxes.
Wasn't paid in taxes,
No
but
government revenue.
it's not government revenue, you're right, but somebody's getting H and K. Who's getting H and K?
Not domestic trade, foreign trade, right?
Yeah, the foreign producers who are lucky enough to get access to get there first, to sell their goods, right, to be part of the quota, those people now, instead of receiving the world price, they receive this price. And so they, instead of receiving L&M, get HK, L&M. Now the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, they probably do only get L&M because they're going to probably spend, they'd be willing to spend up to H and K to gain access to the quota, so to invest in faster ships and other things. And so at the end of the day, Tyler's right, that is going to end up being destroyed by foreign suppliers competing for a scarce quantity that can be sold in the United States. Does that make sense? Sort of thinking through that process. I like kind of saying, it's not just lost, how is it lost, right? And it could be that people just, if we held a lottery where foreign producers gained access to the market under the quota, then they would end up getting H and K, assuming it was a fair lottery, right? If, on the other hand, we say whoever shows up first, or whoever is best friends with Steve Mnuchin, or, right, whoever gives campaign donations, then we would end up as a globe losing H and K. So it actually turns out we'd be better with a lottery as a global society than with giving out favors. Alex?
But wouldn't H and K go to a different market than like the market that's, because like if they're competing to get better, like if they want a better ship, like a faster ship, wouldn't it go to like
True.
ship industry rather
Yes,
than,
but
like,
who's
one
getting the benefit of that faster ship? It's being wasted in effect. Could somebody else have
Yeah.
used the resources that went into that ship to get something else of value? So it's similar, it's what we call rent seeking or rent dissipation. So you think about it, if you go to Washington, D.C., you'll see K Street. I mean, I went to graduate school in Fairfax, Virginia, which is just outside of D.C., and so I spent some time in D.C. There's what's called K Street. There's actually, for those of you who don't know, there's 2 K Streets. There's 2 of every, you've got, Washington, D.C. is odd. It's organized by quadrants. So you've got all of the streets going this way, and all of the streets going this way. This street and this street have the same name. This street and this street have the same name. And all the streets from this point here going north and south, also this street and this street have the same name. So there's actually 4 of each address in the city. And so that's why in DC it's important to know, are we talking northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast?
Oh my god.
So if you go there, just know that if you don't look at that's germane, right? So,
Oh my god.
K Street, this K Street, right down by the Capitol, is effectively a whole bunch of law firms. And these are lawyers whose only job is to lobby Congress. They set up meetings, they try and convince politicians of the interests of their clients, right? They get paid. Do they generate value for society? They generate value for their clients, but basically the resources are consumed in the process. Could they be doing something else of value? Yes, they could be probating wills, they could be settling estates, they could be defending people in civil court, etc. And so that's a case where the amount that's what we call rent dissipation.
Okay.
It's similar to if we were to, if I were to give out, it's one of the hard things for people to remember is that government effectively can't give anything away for free. If I were to give out $100 to the first 3 people who showed up on Wednesday, what would happen? Maybe not much. Maybe I give out $10,000, what would happen?
Go to line.
Yeah, would any of you go home?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't, if I were you, right? I'd call friends, get them to deliver food to me, etc. I'd camp out. You would end up spending up to $10,000 of your time to get the $10,000. Nobody else will get the benefit of that. In effect, it will be lost to society, right? Cameron?
So with those quadrants you're talking about, like, we go like the Capitol, I mean the White House view.
Basically, the White House is all of the, Congress. There's the mall that basically is right here. Congress is at this end, the White House is like here, the Washington Monument is down here, is right here. The Smithsonian museums are and the National Gallery are on each side. Basically, they're right down in the center. Yeah. Other questions? I don't know that we'll have time to go over because I do want to move on to some other things here. We're going to, by the way, there may be something besides what we've drawn up here that counterbalances the benefit from free trade, but we're going to leave that until we get to international finance. That'll probably be the last thing we're going to cover. I think I'll put that at the end, right? We already have some pretty effective tools for looking at international trade. But you may have heard about trade deficits and trade surpluses. That's going to be, right, international finance, international financial accounting, and exchange rates. We'll set that to the end. Next, we're going to move into, I think it's chapter 8 in my version, on growth and prosperity in the big picture, right? Now, for next class, how about we do this for homework? Look at an export subsidy. We do actually have these. Look at the impact of subsidizing companies to export. And just so that we make our lives a little bit, it's a fair analysis, let's look at that in a market where we are already exporting. All right? Does that make sense?
What was the question again?
Assess the impact of an export subsidy. In other words, we pay for every good that our producers sell abroad, we pay them a certain amount, right? Assess the impact of that policy in a market where we are already exporting. Yeah? Cool. This tends to be what people focus on, is tariffs and quotas. But it turns out you may have heard something about the Ex-Im Bank, the Export-Import Bank, a year or two ago. There's questions as to whether we should refund that or not. It's a state agency that in effect provides subsidies for companies to export. So let's take a look at that for next class. All right? Just give you some more homework. Just what you've always wanted.